They thought she was just an old woman, just another easy target. But when a ruthless gang tried to intimidate Eleanor Hayes, they had no idea who they were really dealing with. Because her son, he wasn't just any soldier. He was a Delta Force commander, trained for the deadliest operations in the world. And when he found out what they did, he made sure they'd never forget it. The old gas station at the edge of town was nearly empty, save for the slow-moving figure of Eleanor Hayes. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the cracked pavement as she stepped out of her rusted pickup truck, her silver hair tied in a neat bun beneath her worn-out sun hat. With a calm, practiced motion, she started fueling up, unaware that she was being watched. 3 figures lurked by the convenience store entrance, their eyes locked on the frail woman. Their leader, a lanky man with greasy hair and a cocky smirk, nudged his companions. "Easy pickings," he muttered. The gang had terrorized the small town for weeks, targeting the elderly, the vulnerable, those who wouldn't fight back. And Eleanor, she fit the profile perfectly, or so they thought. As the gang approached, their heavy boots scuffing against the concrete, Eleanor sensed their presence before they even spoke. Decades of experience had sharpened her instincts, but she didn't turn around. Not yet. "Hey, Grandma," the leader called out, a fake sweetness laced in his voice. "Need a hand with that gas, or maybe your wallet's a little too heavy?" The others snickered, stepping closer. Eleanor sighed softly, her grip tightening on the fuel pump. She had been through too much in life to be scared by a few lowlifes. Then, in a voice as steady as steel, she answered, "You should walk away. Right now." The leader chuckled. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" Eleanor turned slowly, locking eyes with him. There was something in her gaze, an eerie calm, an unshaken confidence that made the man hesitate for just a second. And then, she spoke words that would change everything. "No, but my son will be here soon. And when he arrives, you'll wish you never laid eyes on me." The gang didn't know it yet, but they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Because Eleanor Hayes wasn't just some helpless old lady. She was the mother of a Delta Force commander, one of the deadliest soldiers in the world. And when he found out what they had done, there would be no place left for them to hide. The gang leader, known around town as Jace and Slim Carter, smirked as he leaned against the gas pump, his arms crossed over his chest. His 2 lackeys, Tyler and Moose, flanked him on either side, their grins widening at the old woman's words. "Your son?" Jace chuckled. "Let me guess, some local deputy, maybe a farmer with a shotgun." Eleanor didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Moose, a towering brute with tattoos crawling up his thick neck, cracked his knuckles. "Ladies, you don't want to get on Slim's bad side. We're just having a friendly chat." Tyler, the youngest of the trio, reached out, yanking Eleanor's purse from the passenger seat of her truck. "Let's see what you got in here, Granny." That was a mistake. Before he could even open the purse, Eleanor moved with surprising speed. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply, sending pain shooting up his arm. Tyler yelped, stumbling backward. "Tell us what the—" Slim's smirk faltered. "Tough old bird, huh? That's cute." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a switchblade, flicking it open with a metallic snap. The morning light glinted off the blade as he stepped closer. "Now, I don't like when people mess with my boys," he said, twirling the knife lazily in his fingers. "So why don't you be a good granny, hand over your keys, and we'll call it even." Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't want to do this?" Slim laughed. "And why's that?" Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. "Because my son is already here." Slim's head snapped up, his cocky expression shifting into something less certain. Moose turned, scanning the parking lot, and that's when they saw him. A black SUV had pulled into the lot, its engine silent as it idled near the store entrance. The door swung open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the measured confidence of someone who had seen war and survived it. His olive-green shirt was tight over a muscular frame, his tan tactical pants and boots giving him the unmistakable presence of a soldier. But it wasn't just his clothing that made the gang uneasy. It was his eyes, cold, calculating, unshaken. Daniel Hayes had spent the last 15 years as a Delta Force commander, leading elite teams into the most dangerous war zones on Earth. He had dismantled terrorist networks, eliminated high-value targets, and survived ambushes that would have killed lesser men. And now he was home. Daniel's gaze locked onto Eleanor first, scanning her for any sign of injury. When she gave him a small nod, her way of silently saying, "I'm fine," he turned his attention to the gang. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, sharp enough to cut steel. Slim recovered quickly, slipping his knife back into his pocket. "Just having a chat with your mum, buddy. No need to get worked up." Daniel stepped closer, his movements deliberate, controlled. He towered over Slim, his presence alone enough to make Tyler and Moose take a step back. "A chat?" Daniel's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the threat in it. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were trying to rob her." Slim raised his hands in mock innocence. "Come on, man. We didn't lay a hand on her." Daniel's eyes flicked to Tyler, who was still clutching his wrist, then to Eleanor's purse on the ground. His jaw tightened. "Pick it up," he said, his voice low, controlled. Tyler hesitated. "Look, we were just... pick it up." There was something in Daniel's tone that left no room for argument. Tyler scrambled to grab the purse, shoving it back onto Eleanor's seat. Slim's smirk was gone now, replaced by a calculating look. He wasn't stupid. He had been in enough fights to recognize when he was outmatched, but he also wasn't one to back down. "I don't know who you think you are," Slim said, squaring his shoulders. "But you don't own this town." Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying him. "I don't have to own it. I just have to make sure people like you understand there are consequences for your actions." Slim let out a sharp laugh. "Is that right? You some kind of cop?" Daniel took another step forward, closing the gap between them. Slim flinched. "No," Daniel said, his voice deadly calm. "I'm worse." Silence hung in the air. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Moose shifted uneasily. "Let's just go, man." Slim clenched his jaw. He hated being humiliated, especially in front of his crew, but something in Daniel's posture, something in his unshaken stare, told him pushing this further would end badly. Finally, he scoffed, stepping back. "On this ain't over." Daniel didn't react. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Slim turned, striding toward his beat-up car. Tyler and Moose hesitated before following him. As the engine roared to life, Slim cast one last glare at Daniel. You just made yourself an enemy, tough guy." Daniel didn't blink. "You were never my enemy, just a problem that needed solving." The car peeled out of the gas station, tires screeching against the pavement. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. "I told them they should have walked away." Daniel turned to her, his expression softening for the first time. "You okay, Mom?" She smiled. "You know me. I can handle myself." Daniel chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "So that's what I'm afraid of." But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Men like Slim didn't let things go. They nursed grudges, and Daniel Hayes had a feeling they'd be seeing each other again soon. Daniel watched as the taillights of Slim's car disappeared down the road, his mind already running through possible scenarios. He had seen men like Slim before, cowards who relied on intimidation and numbers to control those weaker than them. But the real danger wasn't in their arrogance. It was in their desperation. He turned back to his mother. "Did they touch you?" Eleanor gave him a knowing look. "You saw what happened. They tried to get tough, but they weren't expecting an old woman who knows how to handle herself." Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "Still, they won't take this lightly. People like them see backing down as weakness. They'll want to prove something." Eleanor shrugged. "I'd let them try. I've dealt with worse." Daniel studied her. His mother had always been strong, raising him alone after his father had died when Daniel was just a boy. She had grit, the kind of quiet resilience that had shaped him into the man he had become. But that didn't mean he was going to let a bunch of low-life criminals harass her. "I need to know if they've been around before," he said. "Any trouble lately?" Eleanor hesitated. That was enough to make Daniel's stomach tighten. "Mom?" She sighed, looking away for a moment before meeting his eyes. "They've been hanging around town for a few months now. Small stuff at first, loitering, harassing the clerks at the gas station, pressuring shop owners for protection money. Nobody wanted to make waves, but I could tell it was getting worse." Daniel clenched his jaw. He should have been here. He should have known. "Why didn't you call me?" Eleanor smiled, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Because you've spent the last 15 years in combat zones, Daniel. You deserved some peace. I wasn't going to drag you into a little small-town problem." He shook his head. "This isn't just a small-town problem, Mom. This is how it starts. They test the waters, see who pushes back, and when no one does, they take more. If they think they can get away with it, they will." Eleanor sighed, walking back to her truck. "Well, it looks like you just made sure they won't get away with anything, didn't you?" Daniel followed, his mind already shifting to the next step. "I need to talk to the sheriff. If these guys have been around this long, someone's been keeping track." Eleanor nodded. "Sheriff Riley's an old friend. He won't like seeing you back in town under these circumstances, but he'll be glad for the help." Daniel climbed into the driver's seat of his SUV, waiting for Eleanor to get into her truck before following her down the road. As they drove through town, Daniel took everything in. The old storefronts, the dusty roads, the familiar faces watching from their porches. It had been years since he had called this place home, but nothing really changed in towns like these. Except those, of course, when outsiders tried to change them. Sheriff Riley was sitting behind his desk when Daniel walked in. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his graying mustache making him look every bit the part of an old-school lawman. When he saw Daniel, he let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. If it ain't Daniel Hayes, back from the dead." Daniel smirked. "Good to see you too, Sheriff." Riley leaned back in his chair. "I'd ask what brings you home but something tells me I already know." Daniel took a seat across from him. Slim Carter and his boys. Riley sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, I heard about the gas station." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Riley nodded. "They ran straight to the bar after they left. Word travels fast in a small town." Daniel exhaled. "What do you know about them?" Riley stood up, walking over to a filing cabinet and pulling out a thick folder. He dropped it onto the desk with a thud. "Fayeson, they rolled in about 6 months ago. Started small, minor thefts, bar fights, some vandalism. Then they moved up to intimidation, forcing business owners to pay protection money. Classic playbook. But the real problem..." He opened the file, flipping through pages before landing on a mugshot of Slim Carter. "Slim's got connections," Riley said grimly. "Nothing major, he's no cartel boss, but he's been in and out of prison enough times to know people. If he feels threatened, he'll call in reinforcements." Daniel tapped the picture. "He already feels threatened. Today wasn't the end of it." Riley exhaled. "That's what I was afraid of." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I need to know how far this goes. Who's backing them? Who's scared to speak up?" Riley studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but if you're going to stir this pot, I need to know, are you just here to visit your mum, or are you planning on sticking around?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether or not these guys decide to make this personal." Riley let out a low chuckle. "Something tells me they already have." Daniel stood. "Then I guess I'll be staying a little while." Riley watched him, nodding slowly. "You know, when you left, I always figured you'd come back eventually. Just didn't think it'd be under these circumstances." Daniel smirked. "Neither did I. But deep down, a part of him knew. He had never really left. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who waited for trouble to come knocking. After leaving the sheriff's office, he drove straight to the Rusty Nail, the most notorious bar in town, the kind of place where men like Slim and his gang spent their nights drinking and boasting about their latest exploits. Parking his truck a few blocks away, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped out. He adjusted his jacket, ensuring his holstered weapon was within easy reach, then strode towards the dimly lit establishment. The moment he pushed open the heavy wooden door, the thick scent of cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey hit him. The place was packed with rough-looking men, their loud voices overlapping in drunken conversation. A worn-out jukebox in the corner struggled to play an old country tune over the noise. And there, at a round table near the back, was Slim Jacobs, flanked by his two usual goons, Benny, the Rat, Wilkes, and Johnny, One Eye, Carter. Slim was laughing loudly, his booted feet propped up on the table, a bottle of whiskey clutched in one hand. Daniel moved through the bar like a shadow, unnoticed at first, but as he approached their table, the laughter died down. Slim's eyes narrowed, recognition dawning. "Well, well," Slim drawled, setting his bottle down with a deliberate thud. "If it ain't Mrs. Walker's little boy, you lost, soldier boy?" Daniel didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the bruises on Slim's face, the ones his mother had put there. A slow, dangerous smirk played on his lips. "I figured you'd be here," Daniel said, his voice even, but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Thought maybe you'd want to finish what you started." Slim sat forward, his grin fading. The bar had grown quieter. Everyone was watching. Benny the rat let out a wheezing laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, he's got balls, I'll give him that." Johnny One-Eye cracked his knuckles. "You should have stayed home, Walker." Daniel ignored them, keeping his eyes locked on Slim. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to leave my mother alone. For good." Slim exhaled sharply, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "That's where you're wrong." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "See, your mama made a fool out of me, and I don't take kindly to that. So if anything, this ain't over. It's just starting." Daniel's expression didn't change. Then, in a blur of motion, his hand shot out, grabbing Slim by the collar and slamming his face into the table with bone-rattling force. The entire bar gasped. Slim groaned, blood trickling from his nose as he clawed at Daniel's grip. "You son of a—" Daniel pulled him up just enough to whisper in his ear, "I wasn't asking." Then he released him, letting Slim collapse back into his chair. Johnny and Benny both lunged forward, but Daniel was already 2 steps ahead. Before either of them could act, he drew his combat knife and embedded it in the wooden table, a silent, lethal warning. The entire bar held its breath. Daniel leaned in slightly. "So you boys really want to do this?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Johnny hesitated, his eye darting to the blade. Benny swallowed hard. Slim wiped the blood from his nose, his jaw clenching in barely contained rage. But he knew better. He'd seen that look before. This wasn't just some farm boy standing in front of him. This was a man who had seen war, a man who had survived hell, a man who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever needed to be done. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then Slim forced a laugh, forced it too hard. He tried to play it off, shaking his head. "Man, you're crazy, you know that." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, just waited. Finally, Slim shoved himself back from the table and stood. He adjusted his jacket, muttering a curse under his breath. "Fine," he spat. "We're done." But as he turned toward the door, Daniel caught his wrist. Slim froze. Daniel leaned in close and whispered, so only he could hear, "If you ever so much as breathe in my mother's direction again, you won't be walking out next time." The color drained from Slim's face. Daniel let go. Without another word, Slim turned and walked out of the bar, his 2 men scrambling to follow. The silence in the rusty nail lingered for a long moment, before the normal sounds of conversation slowly resumed. Daniel exhaled, gripping the handle of his knife and pulling it free from the table. Then, without another glance at the bar, he turned and walked out. As he stepped into the cool night air, he knew this wasn't over. Slim might have walked away tonight, but men like him never stayed down for long, and Daniel would be ready. Daniel's truck rumbled down the empty highway, the old diesel engine humming beneath him as his fingers tapped against the steering wheel. The adrenaline was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He had walked out of the rusty nail without a scratch. But he knew this wasn't over. Men like Slim Jacobs didn't let things go. And Daniel had just humiliated him in front of his own crew. His headlights cut through the darkness as he turned onto the long dirt road leading back to his mother's house. The old farmhouse sat on a quiet stretch of land, the wooden porch bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. Inside, Mary Walker was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her, untouched. The moment Daniel stepped through the door, she looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You went looking for trouble, didn't you?" Daniel sighed, closing the door behind him. "I handled it," his mother scoffed, shaking her head. "I don't need you handling anything, Daniel. I've taken care of myself long before you were born." He knew better than to argue with her. Mary Walker wasn't some fragile old woman. She was tough, resilient, the kind of woman who didn't flinch in the face of men like Slim Jacobs. But that didn't mean he was going to sit back and let her fight this war alone. "They won't be bothering you again," he assured her. Mary studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "I hope you're right." But they both knew he wasn't. Slim Jacobs was not the kind of man who let things slide. Back at an old rundown motel just outside of town, he paced furiously across the stained carpet, his jaw tight with rage. His nose was still bleeding from where Daniel had slammed his face into the table, His hands clenched into fists at his sides as Benny the Rat and Johnny One-Eye sat in silence, waiting for their boss to speak. The room smelled of cheap beer and cigarette smoke. Finally, Slim stopped pacing and turned on them. "That little farm boy thinks he can humiliate me," he spat, his voice venomous. "Thinks he can just walk in and threaten me." Benny shifted uncomfortably. "Boss, maybe we should just leave it be. I mean, we've got other places we can go." Slim's glare could have burned a hole through steel. "Are you stupid, Rat? If we back down now, we lose everything." His voice was low, dangerous. "Every small town, nobody will think they can push us around. That Walker boy just put a target on his back, and I intend to remind him who runs this town." Johnny One-Eyed leaned forward, his fingers drumming against the table. "So what's the move?" Slim took a deep breath, then smiled. "Simple." He turned toward the motel's old rotary phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. A few rings later, a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah?" Slim grinned. "It's Slim. I've got a problem that needs fixing." A pause. "Where?" Slim flicked a glance at Benny and Johnny, then at his bruised knuckles. "Walker Farm." Daniel stood on the front porch, his instincts buzzing. It was quiet. Too quiet. He had spent years in combat zones. He knew when something wasn't right. The air had changed. The stillness around the farm felt unnatural. His mother was inside, reading a book by the fireplace, completely unaware that Daniel was already calculating every possible way trouble might come knocking. Then, a sound. Faint. A distant engine in the night. Daniel stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the dirt as he moved toward the truck, reaching inside for his old rifle. The engine sound grew louder. Headlights appeared on the horizon, moving slow. His jaw clenched. They were coming. And this time, it wouldn't just be Slim and his two lackeys. Daniel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the weight of the gun in his hands. They thought they were coming to teach him a lesson. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The headlights drew closer, cutting through the night like the glowing eyes of a predator. Daniel tightened his grip on the rifle, his muscles coiled, his breath steady. He counted the vehicles. 3. The first was an old beat-up pickup truck, the kind that had seen better days but still had plenty of life left in it. The second was a black SUV, tinted windows, reinforced body. That was the one that worried him. The third was a smaller sedan, probably carrying the cleanup crew. Daniel had seen this kind of operation before. First truck, distraction. Second truck, muscle. Third, the guys who show up when things are already finished. They thought they were dealing with some backwater farmer. They had no idea who was waiting for them. Mary Walker closed her book and glanced toward the window, a frown pulling at her lips. Even from inside, she could hear the approaching vehicles. Her grip on the armrest tightened. She might have been old, but she wasn't stupid. Something was wrong. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the chair and moved to the window. The headlights were blinding, moving like slow serpents down the dirt road. Her heart pounded. Then she turned. "Daniel." No answer. She walked toward the door, her hands shaking slightly. Then, a deep voice rumbled behind her. "Stay inside, Ma." Mary turned to see her son standing by the door, rifle in hand, eyes locked onto the road. She swallowed. "You knew this was coming." Daniel gave a slow nod. "Yeah?" Her gaze flicked to the gun, then to his stance, relaxed but coiled, like a wolf watching its prey. Her son wasn't just a soldier. He was something else. The lead truck stopped first, its high beams cutting through the darkness as the engine rumbled to a stop. The SUV pulled in right behind it, and the third car parked further back, staying in the shadows. Daniel watched as doors creaked open. 6 men. He recognized Slim Jacobs immediately. The bandages on his nose were fresh, and his anger was palpable even from a distance. Beside him was a man Daniel had never seen before. Tall, lean, with a viper's grin and dead eyes. Daniel knew the type instantly. A fixer, a hitman. The kind of guy who didn't just rough people up. He made problems disappear. Daniel's stomach coiled with quiet fury. They were here for blood, and he had every intention of sending them home in pieces. Slim spat into the dirt, walking a few steps forward. "Walker!" His voice echoed through the night. "Come on out, boy. Let's have a little talk." Daniel stepped forward slowly, his rifle hanging at his side. He let the silence stretch, let them get nervous. Then, finally, "I don't talk to dead men." A ripple of unease passed through Slim's men. He tilted his head slightly, widened, analyzing Daniel like a predator sizing up another predator. "Big talk for a farm boy?" His voice was smooth, controlled. "You got a name?" Daniel's eyes never wavered. "Daniel Walker." A flicker of recognition crossed the hitman's face, then a smirk. Well, now that's interesting." Slim frowned. "You know this guy?" The hitman let out a low, amused chuckle. "Oh, I've heard stories." His gaze flicked back to Daniel. "You're that Walker? Delta Force? Counter-terrorism? The ghost of Helmand, wasn't it?" Slim visibly stiffened. Daniel just shrugged. "Something like that." The air turned razor-sharp. Slim's confidence began to crack. He had expected a soldier. He hadn't expected a legend. The hitman exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "You know, it's funny. I always wanted to see if the stories were true." Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his rifle. "You're about to find out." The night was still for 1 second too long. Then, Daniel moved. His rifle snapped up in a blur, before any of them could even react. Bang! The first shot punched straight through the knee of one of Slim's men. He went down screaming. Panic erupted. Daniel didn't stop. He was already moving. Bang! Another shot. Another man down. The rest scattered, scrambling for cover. Slim cursed loudly, diving behind the truck. The hitman moved with practiced speed, ducking low and drawing his pistol. But Daniel was faster. He sprinted toward the side of the farmhouse, using the darkness as his ally. He was no longer a man, he was a ghost, and he was hunting. Mary Walker stood by the window, watching the carnage unfold. For a brief moment, she saw something in her son's movements. Not fear, not anger. Something colder. Something she had only seen in his father's eyes long ago. She swallowed hard. This fight wasn't over. Not yet. The night exploded into chaos as Slim's men scrambled for cover, their arrogance shattered by the brutal efficiency of Daniel's opening shots. The farm, once a place of quiet and resilience, had turned into a battleground. The hitman moved swiftly, taking cover behind the black SUV, his eyes scanning for Daniel. Slim, now fully aware he had bitten off more than he could chew, was cursing under his breath, his ego bruised as much as his bleeding nose. Daniel kept moving, staying low, using the shadows as his ally. He had learned long ago that hesitation was the difference between life and death. These men were used to bullying, not real combat. They thrived on fear, on intimidation, but none of them had ever faced a trained killer who had spent years in war zones where death came in silence, swift and final. Benny the Rat was the first to regain some semblance of composure. He crawled behind the hood of the pickup, gripping his pistol so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Where the hell is he?" he hissed, eyes darting through the darkness. The hitman, more experienced than the rest, exhaled calmly, unshaken. "He's hunting us." The word sent a cold shiver down Slim's spine. "That's a damn farmer out there," Slim barked. But the hitman smirked, shaking his head. "No, that's a soldier." Another gunshot split the night. A bullet ricocheted off the truck's hood, inches from Benny's hand. He yelped, jerking back. "We gotta fall back." But Slim wasn't listening. He was still clinging to the belief that he controlled this situation, that Walker was just another tough guy with a gun. "Enough of this," he roared. "We light him up, flush him out, and put him in the ground." He gestured wildly at the farmhouse. "Burn the damn place down if you have to. We own this night." The hitman didn't argue, but his fingers flexed over the grip of his pistol. He knew men like Slim. Loud, desperate, trying to keep their grasp on power when it was slipping through their fingers. And he knew a lost fight when he saw one. Inside the farmhouse, Mary Walker hadn't moved from the window. She saw the flickering muzzle flashes, the shifting figures in the darkness, and she saw her son moving like a shadow, a specter of something they could never understand. She had always known Daniel had come back from the war changed, but now she was seeing just how deep that change ran. Daniel pressed himself against the side of the house, his rifle tight against his chest. He counted the remaining threats. The hitman was the real danger. The others, they were just noise. Slim's voice carried over the gunfire, barking orders, desperate to regain control. That was his mistake. Daniel moved fast. He stepped out from the shadows and fired. The first bullet struck Benny in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The second clipped Johnny's leg, dropping him to his knees. The third, well, that one was meant for Slim. It slammed into the metal of the truck, inches from his head. Slim's face turned pale as he realized just how close he had come to death. The hitman, however, didn't panic. He pivoted, raising his pistol in one fluid motion, and fired off 2 quick shots. Daniel dropped to the ground, rolling into cover, just as the bullets punched into the wooden wall behind him. Finally, a challenge. Daniel exhaled slowly. This man wasn't like the rest. He was disciplined, trained. That meant he had a brain, which meant he knew deep down how this was going to end. From behind the truck, Slim was panting, his mind racing. This was all going wrong. "We gotta go, man," Benny groaned, gripping his bleeding shoulder. "This ain't worth it." But Slim's pride was too big, his fear twisting into anger. "No, we end this." Daniel's voice rang out, calm and steady. "Slim, you already lost?" Silence. Slim's breathing was ragged. His fingers twitched over the grip of his gun, but he hesitated. Daniel kept his voice low, measured. "You think this ends any other way? You think you walk away from this?" The hitman, still crouched behind the SUV, closed his eyes briefly. He had seen this before. The moment a fight was lost, but a fool refused to see it. Daniel stepped forward, rifle still raised. "Take your men. Get in your cars. Drive away." His voice was cold. "Or dig your own graves." The tension in the night was thick, heavy with the weight of a decision. The hitman exhaled and slowly rose, keeping his hands visible. He wasn't a man ruled by ego. He was a man ruled by survival. "Slim," he said quietly. "He's right." Slim's jaw clenched so tight, his teeth ached. But the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He looked around. 2 of his men down, Benny bleeding, Johnny barely able to stand, and the hitman. The hitman was already backing away. Slim swallowed hard, his hands shaking. Then, finally, he dropped his gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. "Get in the damn cars," he growled. The remaining men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled, dragging the wounded as they piled into their vehicles. The hitman was the last to move, his gaze locking with Daniel's. A small nod of respect. Then he slid into the SUV and the convoy peeled away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in the dust. Daniel stood still, watching the taillights disappear down the road. He wasn't relieved. He wasn't victorious. He was just done. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. Mary Walker stepped out, looking at the abandoned battlefield that was her front yard. She let out a long breath, then looked at her son. "So," she said, her voice dry, "are you staying for breakfast?" Daniel, for the first time that night, smiled. "Yeah, Ma, I think I am." The dust hadn't even settled on the gravel road before Daniel exhaled deeply, rolling the tension out of his shoulders. The night was quiet again. No more threats, no more shouting. Just the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the faint creak of the old farmhouse behind him. Mary Walker, standing on the porch, watched her son for a long moment before stepping down onto the dirt, her bare feet sinking slightly into the earth. "You always did have a way of cleaning up a mess," she muttered, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the retreating taillights of Slim's convoy. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. His hands, still steady as stone, loosened their grip on the rifle. "Not sure I'd call that cleaning up," he replied. "More like damage control." His mother nodded knowingly, her gaze drifting toward the dark spots of blood staining the dirt. "They won't be back," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his short, sweat-dampened hair. "No," he agreed, "they won't." But just because those men had driven off into the night didn't mean the trouble was over. Daniel knew how men like Slim operated. Fear and ego ruled them, and those 2 things didn't die easily. There was a chance Slim would regroup, lick his wounds, and decide to come back even meaner. The hitman, though, that was another story. Daniel had seen the moment the man made his choice. He wasn't going to be part of Slim's war anymore. He had measured Daniel, seen exactly what he was dealing with, and had been smart enough to back away. But Slim was dangerous, not because he was capable, but because he was desperate. Daniel turned, finally meeting his mother's gaze fully. In the dim light from the porch, her face looked older, more lined than he remembered, but still every bit as strong. She was studying him the way only a mother could, with that quiet, piercing intuition that saw past the years, past the scars, past the soldier, and straight into her son. "How long were you planning on staying?" she asked. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I wasn't." That word lingered in the air, heavier than it should have been. Mary nodded slowly, as if she'd already known the answer. "And now?" she asked, softer this time. Daniel hesitated, his eyes drifting to the farmhouse, the worn wood, the fields stretching out beyond it, the home he had spent so many years away from. Something in his gut twisted. This place was more than just land. It was history. It was roots. And right now, it was vulnerable. He had left before, but could he do it again? Before he could answer, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the quiet. Daniel stiffened instantly, his instincts reigniting like a fire doused in gasoline. His mother turned her head slightly, listening. The engine was moving fast, too fast for comfort. The headlights crested over the dirt road leading back toward town. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of his mother as he watched the car approach. It wasn't one of Slim's trucks. This was different, smaller, cleaner. Then he saw it, the SUV, the Hitman. The black vehicle slowed as it reached the driveway, stopping just short of where the last fight had taken place. The driver's side door opened, and the Hitman stepped out, his movements careful, non-threatening. He wasn't holding a weapon. In fact, his hands were up slightly, a universal gesture of peace. Daniel didn't relax, but he didn't raise his rifle either. "Not here to fight," the Hitman called out. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something else in it. Respect, maybe even regret. Daniel remained silent, watching him. The Hitman took another step forward, then stopped, glancing around at the aftermath of the night's events. "Hell of a mess," he muttered. Daniel finally spoke. "Didn't expect to see you again." The Hitman shrugged. "Didn't expect to come back," he exhaled, looking Daniel square in the eye. "Slim's not going to let this go." Daniel's jaw clenched. He had figured as much, but hearing it confirmed didn't make it any easier. The Hitman continued. "I cut ties with them. That's done. But Slim? He's not going to just tuck his tail between his legs and walk away. He's pissed, humiliated. Guys like him, they don't handle that well." Daniel nodded slowly. "He coming back?" The Hitman hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe. Not tonight. Not but tomorrow. Yeah, he will." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Finally, the Hitman glanced at the farmhouse, then back to Daniel. "I came back because—" He hesitated, as if unsure how to say what needed to be said. "Look, I don't know you, but I know what I saw tonight. I've worked with killers, real ones, and I know when a man is dangerous." He exhaled. "You're the kind of man I don't want to be on the wrong side of." Daniel tilted his head slightly, waiting. "I don't owe you anything," the Hitman said plainly. "But I'll give you this. Slim's got friends. Bigger friends. He doesn't have the kind of pull to bring them in himself, but if he gets desperate enough—" The Hitman met Daniel's gaze fully. "He might just make that call." Daniel didn't react outwardly, but inside something turned cold. This wasn't over. Not yet. Mary, silent until now, finally spoke. "So what are you saying?" The Hitman glanced at her, then back at Daniel. "I'm saying you might want to be ready." The words lingered in the air, as heavy as the night itself. Daniel didn't blink. He already was. The Hitman's warning settled in Daniel's gut like a stone. He had spent enough years in the field to know that when a man like that gave you a heads up, you didn't ignore it. Slim wasn't just angry. He was a wounded animal. And wounded animals did one of two things. They ran, or they attacked with everything they had left. And Slim. He wasn't the type to run. Daniel turned back toward his mother, her expression unreadable in the dim porch light. "Get some rest," he told her softly. "I'll take care of it." Mary Walker didn't argue. She had raised Daniel to be a man of few words, and she knew by the set of his jaw that his mind was already made up. Instead, she nodded once and stepped back onto the porch. Before she disappeared inside, she said, "Don't let this place turn into another battlefield, Danny." Then the door closed behind her. Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the old wood, listening to the silence of the farm. It was an eerie kind of quiet, one that reminded him of the moments before an ambush, the world holding its breath, waiting for chaos to unfold. The hitman still stood beside his car, watching him carefully. "You think she knows?" he asked. Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "She always knows." The hitman nodded as if he understood. "Look," he said, shifting his stance slightly. "Slim's got a bruised ego, but more than that, he's got debts. Big ones. The kind of debts that make men desperate." He exhaled. "You humiliated him. Bad. If he thinks bringing in outside muscle is his only way of fixing this, he'll do it." Daniel's fingers flexed around the grip of his rifle. "Then I'll deal with them too." The hitman studied him for a long second, then shook his head. "You're really not afraid of much, are you?" Daniel met his gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "Fear's a choice, and I don't choose it." The hitman let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yeah," he muttered. "That tracks." He turned back toward his SUV, pausing as he reached the driver's side door. "For what it's worth," he said over his shoulder, "I didn't come back here to warn you because I thought you needed it. I came back because I respect it." He opened the door, climbed inside him, and started the engine. The headlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the driveway. "If you ever need an extra set of eyes," he said, voice barely audible over the rumbling engine, "you know how to find me." Then he was gone. Daniel watched the taillights disappear into the night before exhaling slowly. He turned, scanning the darkness beyond the fence line. If Slim was coming, he wouldn't come in broad daylight. He'd slink in like a snake, using the shadows as cover, waiting for the right moment to strike. The problem was, there was no right moment against a man like Daniel Walker. He moved quickly, efficiently. First, he secured the farmhouse, making sure every door and window was locked. Then he checked the old barn, the shed, the back gate. He knew every inch of this property like the back of his hand. It wasn't just a farm. It was a fortress. He had spent years building it up, reinforcing it in ways most people wouldn't notice. But to a trained eye, it was clear. This wasn't just some quiet homestead. It was a place built to withstand threats. By the time the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, Daniel was ready. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even considered it. Instead, he sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, watching the road, waiting. Because he knew what Slim didn't, this wasn't Slim's fight anymore. He had lost the second he walked onto this land. The only thing left was for him to realize it. The morning came slow, golden light creeping over the horizon, stretching across the fields in long shadows. The farm was quiet, peaceful. But Daniel knew better than to trust the quiet. He had seen enough sunrises in enough war zones to know that peace never lasted long. And then, right on schedule, he heard it. The distant growl of engines. Not one, not two, 5. Daniel stood slowly, rolling his shoulders as the convoy appeared at the edge of the road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. Slim wasn't coming back to talk. He wasn't coming back to negotiate. He was coming back for war. Daniel flexed his grip on the rifle and exhaled through his nose. So be it. The convoy slowed as it approached the long dirt road leading up to the Walker farm, kicking up a thick cloud of dust that hung in the early morning air. Daniel stood motionless on the porch, watching as the vehicles rolled to a stop just outside the gate. 5 trucks, at least 10 men, maybe more. He could see them through the windshields, shadows shifting, heads turning, low murmurs as they took stock of the farmhouse, the open fields, the man waiting for them like he had all the time in the world. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long golden streaks across the land. But the warmth of it did nothing to ease the cold calculation settling in Daniel's gut. The driver's side door of the lead truck opened first. Slim stepped out, adjusting the brim of his hat, his face still bruised from their last encounter. But this time, he wasn't alone. Her second figure emerged from the passenger seat, and Daniel's gaze flicked toward him, his body already registering the threat before his mind had time to process it fully. Tall, lean, but wiry, built for speed rather than brute strength. He carried himself with a confidence that spoke of experience, the kind of experience Daniel had seen before in places far more dangerous than this. The man's right hand rested lightly on the grip of a pistol holstered at his side, his fingers relaxed but ready. A gunfighter. Not some local thug Slim had pulled off the street. No, this was different. This man was a professional. Daniel took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain loose. The others were stepping out now, boots crunching against gravel, the sound of weapons being adjusted, rifles slung over shoulders, knives checked against belts. It was a show of force. They wanted him to see the numbers, to feel the weight of it. But numbers didn't mean much to a man who had spent his life fighting against impossible odds. Slim took a few steps forward, then stopped just outside the gate, hands resting on his belt. He smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Morning, Walker," he called. His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, an edge of uncertainty. The memory of their last encounter still fresh in his mind. "Nice place you got here." Daniel didn't move. "It was quieter before you showed up." Slim chuckled, shaking his head. "Ain't that just the way life goes? You do a man wrong and suddenly he don't want you around." His smile faded. "You made a mistake last time, Walker. You should have finished it." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I didn't think I had to." The gunfighter at Slim's side shifted slightly, his eyes sharp and calculating. He was sizing Daniel up, reading his stance, looking for tells. Daniel had seen men like him before, killers who didn't waste energy, who only moved when they were sure it would count. Slim glanced around the property, nodding to himself. "See, I got to thinking after our last talk. Figured maybe I needed some outside help. This here's a friend of mine, calls himself Reyes, real good with a gun." He paused, letting the words settle. "Real good at making problems disappear." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That's supposed to scare me?" Slim smirked. "Nah, just figured I'd give you a proper introduction before we put you in the ground." The air between them thickened. The other men had spread out slightly, keeping their distance but staying within range. Daniel could feel the weight of their eyes, the tension coiling in the space between them like a loaded spring. One wrong move, and this entire standoff would explode into something none of them could walk away from. Reyes spoke then, his voice smooth, almost amused. "'How you got a reputation, Walker?" His accent was subtle, his words precise. "Delta, right?" He nodded slightly to himself, as if confirming something. "Yeah, I've heard stories. Some of them are probably even true." His hand twitched, just barely, near the grip of his pistol. "But you know how it goes. No man's unbeatable." Daniel's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Funny, I was just about to say the same thing." A beat of silence. Then Reyes shifted again, his stance changing ever so slightly, and Daniel knew it was coming. The men around them didn't realize it yet. Slim didn't see it, but Daniel did. He saw it in the way Reyes squared his shoulders, in the way his fingers flexed ever so slightly, in the way the gunfighter's breathing changed, shallow, measured, preparing. Daniel had seen it 1,000 times before, in dusty villages and ruined cities and endless stretches of desert, where the difference between life and death came down to fractions of a second. And then Reyes moved. His hand flashed toward his pistol, smooth as a snake striking. But Daniel was faster. His rifle was already up before Reyes had cleared leather, his instincts kicking in before conscious thought could even register. One shot, clean and precise. The sound of it cracked through the morning air like a thunderclap. Reyes staggered back, a look of pure shock flickering across his face before his legs gave out beneath him. His gun never even made it to his hand. For a split second, there was nothing, just silence. Then the rest of Slim's men realized what had happened. And all hell broke loose. The moment Reyes hit the ground, chaos erupted. Slim cursed, stumbling back, his hand scrambling for his gun. The rest of his men hesitated, their minds trying to process what had just happened. How the deadliest man among them had gone down before he'd even cleared his holster. But hesitation was a fatal mistake. Daniel moved first. His rifle kicked back against his shoulder as he fired again, hitting the nearest man square in the chest. The outlaw crumpled before he could even scream, his revolver slipping from lifeless fingers and clattering onto the gravel. Another bandit, a younger one with wild eyes and an unsteady grip, yanked his shotgun up to fire. But Daniel had already pivoted. One clean shot, straight through the sternum. The kid collapsed against the hood of the truck before sliding lifelessly to the ground. The remaining outlaws scattered, some diving behind the trucks, others running for the open fields beyond the property line. Slim wasn't one of them. He ducked behind the nearest vehicle, cursing as he fumbled to reload his revolver, sweat slicking his forehead. His confidence, his smug arrogance, it was gone. In its place was a man finally realizing that he was in way over his head. Daniel, however, wasn't done. He kept moving, his body running on instincts forged in war zones and battlefields. He reloaded with quick, practiced motions, scanning the property for movement. A shadow darted near the barn, one of Slim's men trying to flank him. Daniel exhaled slowly, raised his rifle, and squeezed the trigger. A sharp yelp, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the dirt. The air smelled of gunpowder now, thick and acrid. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, a horse neighed in distress. Daniel didn't blink. He kept his breathing steady, his hands firm but relaxed. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated. He didn't waste a single shot. Slim peeked out from behind the truck, eyes darting, nostrils flaring. "Damn it, Walker, you don't gotta do this." Daniel's voice was calm, steady, lethal. "You shouldn't have come back, Slim. Look, we can talk about this." Slim was sweating through his shirt now, his hands trembling as he gripped his pistol. "I can walk away. You hear me? You don't gotta kill me." Daniel took a slow step forward, rifle still trained. "That's the thing about men like you, Slim. You always come back." Slim's jaw clenched, and in that split second, Daniel saw the decision flash across his face. Desperation. A man with nowhere left to run. He moved, but Daniel was faster. A single shot rang out, cutting through the morning air like the final toll of a church bell. Slim staggered back against the truck, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. He looked down at it, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. His lips parted, a ragged breath escaping. Then he slumped to the ground, eyes staring up at the sky, unseeing. Silence fell over the Walker farm. The only sound was the distant rustling of the wind through the dry grass, the slow creak of the farmhouse porch settling under the weight of the past. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his rifle still raised, his heart still beating in the steady rhythm of a man who had survived far worse. He scanned the bodies, checking for movement, for any lingering threats, but there were none. The fight was over. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. From inside the house, the screen door creaked open. His mother stepped out onto the porch, her expression unreadable. She took in the scene, the bodies, the blood, the still smoking rifle in her son's hands, and then she met his gaze. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally she exhaled softly. "You always were a good shot." Daniel let out a breath, the last remnants of adrenaline slowly bleeding from his system. "I had a good teacher." She nodded, her gaze flickering toward the horizon where the sun had risen higher now, bathing the land in golden light. "Gonna have to clean all this up before supper." Daniel huffed a quiet, humorless laugh. "Yeah?" His mother turned back toward the house, pushing open the screen door. "You hungry?" Daniel glanced down at the rifle in his hands, then at the bodies strewn across his land. He took one last deep breath, pushing away the weight of it all, then followed her inside. "Yeah, I could eat." The Walker farm was safe again for now, but Daniel knew better than anyone. Some battles never really end. The morning light streamed through the farmhouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. But he wasn't drinking. His hands were steady, resting lightly on the surface, fingers curled just enough to suggest readiness. His mother moved about the kitchen, placing a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, a side of bacon. A normal breakfast for what had been anything but a normal morning. The weight of the past few hours pressed against his ribs like an iron vice, but his face remained calm, his breathing even. He had learned long ago that battles didn't just happen in the field. Some of the worst ones followed you home. Outside, the aftermath still lingered. Bodies were cooling in the dirt. The air still carried the scent of gunpowder and blood, but the sun had risen higher now, and with it came the quiet inevitability of moving forward. Daniel knew this wasn't over. Slim and his gang had been wiped out, but that didn't mean the trouble ended here. There were always more men willing to take what didn't belong to them, always more outlaws looking for easy prey. His mother sat across from him, watching him with the same quiet intensity she always had. She didn't flinch at the blood on his sleeves, didn't comment on the rifle leaning against the wall behind him. She simply picked up her coffee cup and took a sip, letting the silence stretch between them. "You gonna stay this time?" she asked finally, her voice calm, steady. Daniel considered the question. He had spent years moving, chasing ghosts, running from things even he didn't fully understand. But something had changed today. The men who had come here weren't just looking for trouble. They had brought it straight to his doorstep, and he had answered. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. His mother studied him for a long moment before nodding. "They'll come looking, you know. Someone always does." Daniel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight he knew would never fully leave him. "Let 'em come." A faint smile touched the corners of her mouth. She had raised a warrior, not a man who backed down. And while she wished he could find peace, she also knew the world didn't work like that, not for men like him. The sound of an engine in the distance drew their attention. Daniel's body reacted before his mind even caught up. His hand was already on his pistol, his posture straightening as he turned toward the window. A single vehicle rolled down the dirt road, dust kicking up behind it. A police cruiser. Daniel relaxed, but only slightly. The sheriff had taken his sweet time getting here. Minutes later, boots crunched against the gravel outside. And then there was a knock at the door. His mother stood, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she made her way over. She opened the door without hesitation, revealing Sheriff Bill Dawson standing on the porch, his hat tilted low over his eyes. He took one look at the scene behind her, the bodies, the blood, the bullet holes in the dirt, and sighed heavily. "Well, hell," Dawson muttered. Daniel pushed his chair back, standing slowly. "Took you long enough." Dawson let out a tired chuckle. "Didn't figure you needed me." His gaze swept the yard again before landing back on Daniel. "You all right?" "Fine." The sheriff exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I got a lot of paperwork ahead of me." He looked at Daniel's mother, then back at Daniel. "Gonna be a hell of a story, but I reckon you'll be cleared. These boys came looking for trouble. They found it," Daniel said simply. Dawson nodded. "Reckon they did." A silence settled between them before the sheriff finally sighed again. "I'll get the bodies cleaned up, but you know this ain't the end of it." Daniel nodded. "It never is." Dawson studied him for a moment before stepping back. "You need anything? You let me know?" Daniel didn't respond. He just watched as the sheriff turned, making his way back to his cruiser. The lawman was right. This wasn't over. It never really was. As Dawson's car disappeared down the road, Daniel turned back to the house. His mother was still standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. "You're staying," she said. Not a question, a statement. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I am." For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. The Walker farm would stand. And if trouble came knocking again, well, Daniel would be waiting. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long golden rays over the quiet Texas farm. The dust had settled. The echoes of gunfire long faded. But the weight of what had happened lingered in the air like the smell of burnt powder. Daniel Walker stood on the porch, a fresh cup of coffee in his hands, watching the horizon as if expecting something or someone to come out of the distance. The land stretched endlessly before him, just as it always had. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a place that had been reclaimed, a place that now stood under his protection. His mother stepped outside, arms folded as she studied him. "You never were one to take the easy road," she murmured, and there was no reproach in her voice, just understanding. Daniel smirked faintly, taking a slow sip of coffee. Not much of an easy road left anymore. She nodded, glancing toward the dirt path where the sheriff's car had disappeared. "Reckon trouble'll come knocking again." Daniel exhaled, setting his mug down on the porch railing. "Reckon it will." A beat of silence passed before his mother spoke again. "And?" Daniel looked at her, his green eyes steady, calm. "And I'll be here." The words carried weight, a finality that neither of them questioned. The days of running were over. The world may have changed, but some things never did. Men like Slim, gangs like his, they were always out there, looking for the weak, the unprotected. But they'd made a mistake coming here, and if others made the same mistake, well, Daniel was ready. The land was quiet now, the cattle grazing in the far fields, the barn doors swaying gently in the warm afternoon breeze. It was peaceful, his mother's kind of peace. And now, it was his kind too. But beneath that peace, there was a new certainty, a silent message to anyone who dared threaten it again. This land was defended. The Walker farm stood, and it always would. And that's the kind of strength this world still needs, the kind that doesn't boast, doesn't seek trouble, but never backs down when it comes. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We've got more tales of grit, justice, and unstoppable will coming your way. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Click on the next video and let's keep this ride going.